Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and this is the Autoimmune Protocol Lecture Series, Week 2, Lecture 1, Nutrient Density and the Immune System. One of the concepts that we introduced last week is the idea that nutrient deficiencies impact immune function. And that's where I want to start when we talk about the basic tenets of the autoimmune protocol. I want to talk about why it's so important to hone in on the most nutrient-dense foods available to us and why that is such a critical aspect of health and healing. So remember that autoimmune disease is caused by this targeted attack of the immune system on tissues in our body. And that certainly factors that are outside of our control are part of this situation. So genetic susceptibility accounts for approximately 1/3 of our risk factors for autoimmune disease. Infection, environmental triggers, and just plain old bad luck is certainly a component. But then there's this diet and lifestyle aspect. And what is so empowering about the idea that diet and lifestyle can be contributors to autoimmune disease is that these things are modifiable. We can change what we eat, we can change our lifestyle priorities, and we can remove the stimulus to the immune system to go on like overdrive and overactive and attack tissues in our body. And so nutrient density is a key pillar that impacts this drive of the immune system, how the immune system is regulating itself, how the immune system is functioning efficiently. So nutrient density is a really key concept within the autoimmune protocol. Now, understanding that the role that nutrition, that diet has in health and disease is certainly complex. But micronutrients is really key in this equation, especially in terms of how the immune system is functioning and regulating itself. So what are micronutrients? Micronutrients are nutrients that we need in very small quantities. So vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, these are all micronutrients, but so are essential amino acids, essential fatty acids. These are all of the basic building blocks of our cells, of our tissues, of our hormones. They're also all of the raw materials for all of the chemical reactions that are happening in our body in every moment. If you don't have the raw materials, if you don't have the building blocks, how can you expect your body to be healthy? How can you expect it to function the way it's supposed to? Macronutrients, on the other hand, are the things we need in big quantities, and it really translates to energy. So protein, fat, carbohydrates. Macronutrients are also building blocks. They're also raw materials, but these are the things that we need in larger quantities. But when we're talking about the role that nutrition has in disease, what we're really honing in on is the role that micronutrients have, because these deficiencies in micronutrients has a direct impact on how different biological systems function. Now, as I mentioned last week, the immune system is a nutrient hog, and it uses nutrient resources like no other system in the human body. And it uses pretty much every essential micronutrient in some capacity. But there are key nutrients that we're going to talk about today that are really fundamental in immune regulation. And these are vitamin A, D, E, K2, vitamins B6, B9, which is also folate, vitamin B12, and vitamin C. And then the minerals, zinc, selenium, iodine, iron, magnesium, copper, phytochemicals, which we can only get from plant foods, and omega-3 fatty acids. When you're deficient in any one of these micronutrients, this impacts how the immune system functions. And so deficiency in all of these micronutrients are specifically linked to autoimmune disease. So let's, broad strokes, look at what these different nutrients actually do in the immune system. So vitamin A has a role as an immune regulator, and it impacts cell differentiation, so how cells mature, what cell types they become. Vitamin D, also an important immune regulator and necessary for regulatory T cell function. Vitamin E is a really important antioxidant, as is vitamin K2. Vitamins B6, B9, and B12 are all important in methylation. We talked a little bit about methylation in the context of MTHFR gene variants, but methylation is very, very important for detoxification systems. That's its primary input into autoimmune disease. Of course, methylation has other effects in the human body, for example, methylating neurotransmitters, so it's important in mental health, but in the context of autoimmune disease, we're really worried about the detoxification systems. Vitamin B12 is also important in cell production. Vitamin C is another very important antioxidant for the body. Zinc is required for T cell development and activation, and also for helps control the production of various cytokines. Selenium enzymes are important antioxidant enzymes, and selenium also has roles in cell function and activation. Iodine is actually, we think of it as being really important for thyroid health, which of course it is, but it's also important for phagocyte health, right? Those eater cells that can engulf pathogens. Iron is important for the function of many antioxidant enzymes. Magnesium is actually essential for thymus gland health. Copper is important for controlling cell proliferation, so how cells divide, and also cytokine production, producing those chemical messengers of inflammation. Phytochemicals have really important antioxidant activity. Many of them are also anti-inflammatory. And omega-3 fatty acids, those affect a lot of cell signaling for inflammation, but also phagocyte health. So it's really, really important for the membrane dynamics of these eater cells to be able to engulf pathogens. Now, we're talking about nutrient deficiency as being a possible cause or contributor to autoimmune disease, but how common are deficiencies? The answer to this question, unfortunately, is very. A variety of analyses have looked at percentage of children and adults who are not meeting the recommended daily allowance of vital nutrients. And they come up with slightly different numbers depending on whether or not they include supplements and fortified foods. This is analysis that looks at the top dozen or so nutrients that most of us are deficient in. So you can see that deficiencies ranged from 17-ish% of us not getting the RDA vitamin B12 to 73% of us not getting the RDA of zinc. And when you look at this list, these are the nutrients that we are most deficient in generally, that we're not getting enough of from our diet. Most of them are essential immune modulators. So vitamin B12, B3, B9, and vitamin C and vitamin A are all on this list. Iron, magnesium, zinc are on this list. These are all essential immune health nutrients, and we are not getting enough on a standard American diet by a long shot. So really key for the autoimmune protocol is focusing on nutrient sufficiency. This means that we are getting adequate amounts of all of the nutrients that our bodies need in synergistic quantities to each other. So it means we're getting everything that we need. And we do this by focusing in on the most nutrient-dense foods available to us. And we're gonna dive into why organ meat and seafood and vegetables are such important pillars of a healthy diet in the next few lectures. But for now, understanding that nutrient sufficiency comes from eating the most nutrient-dense foods available to us, this is why this is such an important tenet of the autoimmune protocol. Nutrient deficiencies, their source is in many ways the shift in the American diet that's happened over the last 50-ish years. 100 years ago, even though a lot of the foods that we're going to eliminate on the autoimmune protocol were still part of the typical standard American diet, there was a lot more vegetable consumption, a lot more animal food consumption, and these foods were whole foods, right? They were the vegetables from the farmer down the road, they were the meat cuts from the butcher, the fish bought from the fishmonger, and they were tend to be prepared in fairly simple ways. Nowadays, the dominant foods that we have in the food supply are refined and manufactured foods. So you think of going to a grocery store, how many of those foods have been processed or even ultra processed to become something that's really devoid in nutrition, but hyper palatable, so actually addictive in terms of flavor. So these are foods that have a lot of additives to make them taste better, to trigger our reward circuitry in our brain. But the more these foods are processed, the more steps that they undergo between the whole food initial ingredients and the thing that actually is on your plate, the fewer nutrients it has at the end. So the more those vital nutrients are stripped out. And you can see that these processed or manufactured foods have really displaced whole foods in our diet. This graph shows the percentage of carbohydrates that we eat and what percentage of those carbohydrates is fiber. And that's a really good measure of a whole food carbohydrate, like a fruit or a vegetable, versus a refined food carbohydrate, white bread. And we can see that the amount of fiber that we're getting has decreased dramatically over the last 100 years, even though carbohydrate intake has remained quite high. And that is one of the biggest contributors to nutrient deficiencies, the fact that we're eating these refined manufactured foods. And we see the same thing in our fat consumption. So unrefined natural fats tend to be high in fat-soluble vitamins. So butter or tallow or lard, these are really high in vitamins A and D and K2. High-quality olive oil, right? Fresh pressed olive oil is very, very high in vitamin E. These are not the dominant fats that are being used in the standard American diet anymore. They've been displaced by safflower oil, corn oil, canola oil, and these oils have very, very little in terms of nutrients inherent to them because they're so processed. It's not just rendered fat from animal fat or a cold pressed oil from a plant that naturally exudes oil. These are typically exuded under high pressure and sometimes also high heat, and it damages what nutrients may have been in that oil to begin with. And we've seen over the last 70 years that these manufactured vegetable oils have really overtaken the types of fats that are in our food supply compared to 100 years ago, where we really got sort of equal quantities fat from plant fats and animal fats. They tended to be, whole food plant sources, right? They were really high quality fats because they came from a whole food. Now they're processed and manufactured. They tend to be oxidized fats. And even though high-fat diets have been very, very strongly espoused for the last 40, 50 years, we're still eating actually a lot more fat than we did 100 years ago. So in terms of our foods getting more refined, that is a source of nutrient deficiencies. But even when we hone in on those nutrient-dense staples like vegetables, they're less nutritious now than they used to be. So part of this has to do with the various cultivars that are grown. They're chosen now, right? What kind of carrot you can get in the grocery store is chosen for its shelf life now. It's chosen for being hardy through storage and transportation. It's not chosen for its flavor or for its nutritive value. So if you look at the type of vegetables and fruit that you can get in the grocery store, they don't have as many nutrients as the same vegetables and fruit did 50 years ago, partly because of the cultivars, partly because they're stored and transported over longer distances, stored over longer periods of time, and partly because the soil they're grown in is depleted compared to 50 years ago. So we see with these industrial farming practices, with these big monocrop operations, that the soil gets more and more depleted over time. The fertilizers that are used tend to only have a few different minerals. What that means is there's fewer minerals in the soil for the crops that are grown in that soil to absorb. So the foods grown in that depleted soil cannot have as much nutrition as it did back 50 years ago before the soil was as depleted. So we see, for example, vitamin A is about 18% lower and these are in sort of beta carotene in fruits and vegetables now compared to the 1950s. Vitamin B2 is 38% lower. This is a pretty big difference in terms of the nutritive value of these really great nutritious foods. Looking at some minerals, copper is particularly sad because vegetables have only about 20% of the copper now compared to the 1950s. But magnesium, we're looking at a 35% reduction in magnesium in vegetables now compared to the 1950s. We're looking at a 40% reduction in sodium. Most people aren't deficient in sodium, but it's still a really good illustration of how soil quality impacts the quality of the foods that are grown in it, and how looking at heirloom varieties can be a really great way to increase the nutrient density of those foods. But probably the biggest source of nutrient deficiencies really comes from dietary guidelines. As we talked about in week 1, we had this big switch with the food pyramid from guidelines that sort of focused equally on several food groups to the base of our diet being grains and upwards of 11 servings a day being recommended of this really nutrient poor food. Grains really have very little to offer. In fact, grain-based diets are inherently nutrient poor. They are very misrepresented. They are not nutritional powerhouses in any way. You probably have heard all the time, we need to eat our grains to get our fiber. Meanwhile, vegetables and fruit have just as much fiber, way more vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals, and less sugar than grains do. So if you swap out grains with vegetables or fruit on your plate, you win every single time. You know, we talked about cereal grain fortification as a key, change for addressing malnutrition. They were fortified because grain-based diets are inherently nutrient poor. That's why they needed to be fortified in the first place. Grains tend to have a high glycemic load, which is driving blood sugar responses and insulin resistance. And what we're going to talk about next week is there's various compounds in grains that are inherently inflammatory, that disrupt gut health, and that can be problematic in a lot of other ways. So I said you win every single time if you put a vegetable on your plate instead of a serving of pasta or a serving of a bread roll. And this graph illustrates just how much more nutrition vitamins have than grains. So this is looking at the percentage of essential nutrients in whole wheat compared to an average of 8 healthy vegetables, just any, carrots, broccoli, sweet potatoes, things that you can get in any grocery store. And what you can see is that whole wheat and vegetables are comparable for just a couple of nutrients, right? Manganese, selenium, that's about it. There's more fiber in vegetables. There's more, up to, hundreds of times more nutrients, right? Hundreds of times more vitamin A precursors, double to 10 times more of these essential B vitamins and minerals. Vegetables just have way more to offer us than grains. So when we replace a vegetable-based diet with a grain-based diet, we put grains at the bottom of the pyramid, we are missing out on all of the nutrition that we could be getting from fruits and vegetables. But even meat has more nutrition than grains by a long shot. This graph looks at a variety of what are considered like the healthiest whole grains and some common meat options. And you can see that in every single case, except for vitamin E, in which they're both nutritionally underwhelming, in every other case, meat has way more nutrition per calorie than grains do. So no matter what takes the place of grains on your plate, you are dramatically increasing the nutrient density of your diet. So that's the standard American diet. But what if you're paleo or primal? How does that stack up? Are you really walking into the autoimmune protocol with deficiencies? Well, the answer is probably. There have been various analyses of sort of standard out-of-the-box paleo diet, one that sort of recommends lean meats and vegetables and coconut oil, right? They've looked at various meal plans and some of the more popular paleo and primal cookbooks and evaluated them for nutrient deficiencies. And while paleo and primal diets certainly beat out a lot of the competitors, there is still the possibility of some nutrient deficiencies. Some of the big ones that we see commonly deficient in the paleo diet is calcium, chromium, biotin, vitamin B9, choline, vitamin E, vitamin K2, vitamin D, vitamin B12, iron, magnesium, manganese, potassium, iodine, and selenium. And you'll recognize that a lot of those are immune health nutrients. So even coming from a diet where you're honing in on some more nutritious foods can still leave you with nutrient deficiencies. So really this boils down to eating foods that as a society we have come to associate with being gross. Eating shellfish, eating organ meat, eating sea vegetables. Insects are an incredibly nutrient-dense protein source. And probably most of you watching this now want to turn off this video because I just talked about all the grossest foods possible. So we have this societal aversion to these nutrient powerhouses, to these foods that provide our bodies with vital nutrition. These aversions don't exist in other cultures. So most of the healthiest cultures in the world eat insects on a regular basis. even 50 years ago, right? My grandparents' generation, organ meat was part of the regular rotation. Steak and kidney pie, liver and onions, those were foods that were embraced. So we've got this weird shift where we expect food to be addictively delicious, and we've come to associate the actual most nourishing foods as being gross and disgusting. So while I'm not saying you need to run out and buy crickets and liver and oysters and seaweed and kelp and just eat that for the next 6 weeks, I do want you to start thinking about your preconceived notions of these foods and ways that you might be able to let those biases go, because it's really important to figure out ways of integrating more of these foods into your diet. And I'm hoping by the end of this week, you'll be very convinced of the importance of all of these foods in an optimal human diet. So we look at the role that nutrient deficiencies play in autoimmune disease in general. We're looking at a lot of immune health nutrients that are deficient in the entire population. And we're going to go through these nutrients that are really key immune modulating nutrients, each individually, and really emphasize the roles that these nutrients have in immune function. So vitamin A, 56-ish% of us are deficient. Vitamin A has diverse functions in the human body. It's really important for bone health, for vision, but it's really essential for immune health, and that's why we're going to talk about it in more detail. In the innate immune system, vitamin A is required by inflammatory cells to function. Think about that for a second. So all of these eater cells, right? Neutrophils, macrophages, natural killer cells, which are responsible for killing precancerous cells. These cells require vitamin A to do their job. If you're vitamin A deficient, these effector cells, they can be around, they can't actually work effectively. In terms of the adaptive immune system, deficiencies in vitamin A decreases type 2 helper T cells, which are important for driving antibody formation, but increase type 17 helper T cells, which of course drive inflammatory cells, macrophages, cytotoxic T cells. But here's the kicker. Vitamin A is required for regulatory T cell formation in the thymus. So if you're vitamin A deficient, which 56% of us are, that automatically can skew that balance between regulatory T cells and effector T cells. So you're automatically shorting yourself on those important immune regulators that are going to help calm everything down. Deficiency in vitamin A has been specifically associated with alopecia, multiple sclerosis, and autoimmune hepatitis. Now, what foods are the highest food sources of vitamin A? Well, top king is liver, but we can also find vitamin A in red meat, pork, poultry, fish, shellfish, and vitamin A precursors. Now, they have to be converted into active vitamin A in dark leafy greens, any kind of vegetables that are bright orange, like carrots and sweet potatoes, and also any vegetables from the onion family. That's onions, garlic, leeks, things like that. Vitamin D, about 75% of us in Western countries are deficient. And vitamin D is essential. It controls more than 2,000 genes. So it has very diverse functions, from mineral metabolism that affects bone health, neurotropic factors that affects mental health, hormone regulation, just cell survival. So how well your tissues are repairing and maintaining themselves. It's essential for circadian rhythms. In terms of the innate immune system, vitamin D regulates the formation of antioxidants. So when you're vitamin D deficient, you can't form antioxidants, which are really key in reducing damage from free radicals, right? Reactive oxygen species, also really key in reducing inflammation. And vitamin D modulates the activity of macrophages and dendritic cells, these sentinel cells that are in all tissues waiting for pathogen to arrive to alert the rest of the immune system. Now, in terms of the adaptive immune system, vitamin D controls the subpopulations of T cells, and specifically it decreases Th1 cells. Overactive Th1 cells is one of the major culprits in the immune dysfunction that's happening in autoimmune disease. Vitamin D modulates the activity of T cells and B cells, so it has very, very important regulatory actions. And here's the kicker, Regulatory T cell function is dependent on vitamin D. So if you're vitamin D deficient, even if you're making enough regulatory T cells, they can't do their job. So vitamin D deficiency has been linked with a large collection of autoimmune diseases. These include lupus, type 1 diabetes, autoimmune interstitial lung disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, celiac disease, psoriasis, and inflammatory bowel diseases. Now, we think about vitamin D as the nutrient that we make from exposure to the sun. Our cells convert UVB radiation. They actually convert cholesterol in response to UVB radiation into vitamin D, but we do get some from food, and the top food sources are fish and shellfish, also grass-fed dairy products, pastured eggs, grass-fed meat, pasture-raised meat, so any kind of animal that's raised outdoors. And we also get some vitamin D from mushrooms and tofu. That's D2, not the active form, so it needs to be converted. Vitamin E, 60% of us are deficient. And vitamin E is a really important antioxidant, and it has that role in the immune system. So in the innate immune system, its role as an antioxidant helps protect tissue from accidental damage from the immune system, and it helps actually control the inflammatory signals. In the adaptive immune system, vitamin E is important for controlling the differentiation of T cells in the thymus, specifically that positive selection step that we talked about in week 1. Deficiency in vitamin E has been associated with psoriasis, vitiligo, alopecia, and rheumatoid arthritis. Where do we get vitamin E? We get it from nuts and seeds and leafy greens. Avocados are particularly high, olives. We also get some from organ meat and shellfish, unrefined plant oils, so a really high quality olive oil, fatty fish, and winter squash. Vitamin K. Vitamin K has diverse functions. We associate it with blood clotting factors, especially, so you need it for your platelets to work properly. But it also has important roles in bone and dental health. Vitamin K2 is a very important antioxidant, and it seems to be just generally anti-inflammatory. Now, even though vitamin K or vitamin K2 deficiency hasn't been specifically associated with autoimmune disease, we know that supplementation with K2, at least in animal models, can help improve symptoms of multiple sclerosis, reduce inflammation, and top sources is fermented soy, natto, but we also get it from a lot of high quality animal products, especially liver, eggs, grass-fed dairy, fish, and we can get it from cruciferous vegetables, leafy greens, asparagus, cucumbers, prunes. These are foods that are predominantly sources of K1, but a healthy gut microbial environment can convert that K1 into K2. Vitamin B6. 54% of us are deficient. And vitamin B6 has a lot of different options. So it's involved in metabolism of both proteins and fats. It's required for gluconeogenesis. It's required for the synthesis of neurotransmitters, the synthesis of hemoglobin. That's the molecule in your blood that helps transport oxygen throughout your body. And it, of course, supports methylation. So then it has roles in detoxification. And in fact, changes in methylation, which can be caused by nutrient deficiency. It doesn't just get caused by MTHFR gene variants. You can impact your methylation by being deficient in especially these really important B vitamins. This is highly implicated in autoimmune disease, and specifically B6 deficiency is associated with type 1 diabetes. Where do we get B6? Lots of vegetables, peppers, the onion family, pistachios, also liver, fish, meat, including poultry and red meat, sunflower seeds, garlic, and dark leafy greens. Vitamin B9, folate. 75% of us are deficient. And folate is incredibly important. So it's just generally important for metabolism, and generally important for cell division. It's required for the production of red blood cells. And of course, it's required for methylation. So being deficient in vitamin B9 can mean that we don't methylate properly, which means we don't detoxify properly. And that's strongly implicated in autoimmune disease. Folate deficiency has been associated with cerebral folate deficiency syndrome. That's probably not a surprise, but also rheumatoid arthritis, Sjogren's syndrome, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. Where do we get folate? Organ meat in general, green vegetables, especially leafy green vegetables, legumes in general, beets, asparagus, avocados, papaya, strawberries, and seaweed. Vitamin B12. Approximately 30% of us are deficient. And vitamin B12, again, very important for metabolism, cell division, production of red blood cells, and an important methylation vitamin. And deficiency in vitamin B12 has been associated with multiple sclerosis, celiac disease, Sjogren's, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, autoimmune atrophic gastritis, alopecia, and type 1 diabetes. Where do we get B12? B12 we must get from animal foods. Organ meat, fish, and shellfish are our best sources, but also red meat, pork, poultry, eggs. We do get some from nutritional yeast, fermented soy like tempeh, and also grass-fed dairy. Iron. 39% of us are deficient, and iron has some really important roles as the most dominant mineral in the human body. So it is a key component of hemoglobin, so it's important then for oxygen transport throughout the body. A huge family of enzymes that are important for antioxidant functions in the body, the cytochrome P450 superfamily, are iron-based molecules. A lot of the cytochrome P450 family are important for detoxification processes in liver. So when we're iron deficient, we're hurting a lot of our antioxidant and detoxification systems. Iron is required for metabolizing B vitamins. So iron deficiency can then lead to methylation problems because we're not able to convert B vitamins into their active forms. Iron is a cofactor for a tremendous number of enzymes, which means that iron needs to be there for that enzyme to do its job. And it's also important for protein metabolism. In the immune system, its dominant contribution is through the activity of the cytochrome P450 superfamily. So it's through those antioxidant enzymes. Now, deficiency in iron is a hallmark of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, autoimmune aplastic anemia, and pernicious anemia. But we also see deficiency in iron associated with rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune gastritis, lupus, Sjogren's, and celiac disease. So where do we get iron? Liver and organ meat is our best source. Shellfish is our second best source. We also get it from red meat. And then a less absorbable form we can get from vegetables, leafy greens, green vegetables, legumes, olives, nuts and seeds, dark chocolate. But our most absorbable forms come from red meat. Copper. 31% of us are deficient. Copper has a ton of roles inside the human body. It's important for bone formation. Bone health is not just about calcium. We actually need copper to be able to absorb and use iron. So if you're copper deficient, you can have the symptoms of iron deficiency. And then if you're iron deficient, you can have the symptoms of B vitamin deficiency. This is why synergy is so important. We need the full complement of essential vitamins and minerals to be able to be healthy. Copper is important for connective tissue formations. Connective tissue is everything in between your cells. So that includes things like joints and bone, but it also includes just the glue between cells. So if you can't form strong connective tissues, then you don't have strong barriers. You don't have a strong skin barrier, you don't have a strong gut barrier. Copper is also important for production of RNA, phospholipids, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. This is the energy molecule that's used by all cells. When you consume energy in the form of carbohydrates or protein or fat, it has to be converted into ATP for your cells to use it, and that requires copper, and protein metabolism in general. In the adaptive immune system, copper is responsible for or is involved in the production of some cytokines by T cells. So if you are copper deficient, that impacts the type of signaling that cells and the immune system can send to each other. And it also regulates T cell proliferation. So if you're copper deficient, it changes the types of subsets of T cells that your body can produce. Copper deficiency is associated with rheumatoid arthritis and pemphigus vulgaris. So where do we get copper? Liver and organ meat, again, are our best sources, as are shellfish, nuts and seeds, lentils, dark chocolate, dried apricots, asparagus, leafy greens, and mushrooms. Selenium. 15% of us are deficient. Selenium has a lot of functions through being a component of selenoenzymes. as a selenoenzyme. It's mainly antioxidant roles, but for example, glutathione peroxidase, one of our most important antioxidant enzymes, it's a critical antioxidant throughout the body, is based on selenium. Thioredoxin reductase, an important enzyme for creating thyroid hormone. It's also very critical for cellular redox regulation. Iodothyronine deiodinases are the enzymes that catalyze the conversion from T4 to T3, also a selenoenzyme, so it's based on selenium, and these have then profound downstream effects. So if you're affecting antioxidant systems, if you're affecting thyroid hormones, then that's impacting inflammation, that's impacting metabolism, it goes all the way downstream. In the innate immune system, selenium is important for activation of neutrophils and natural killer cells. So being selenium deficient means that those cells can't do their job properly, they can't be activated when needed. And selenium helps control cytokine production. So again, selenium deficiency changes the cellular signaling that cells in the immune system can send to each other. In the adaptive immune system, selenium is essential for T cell function. That includes effector T cells and regulatory T cells. It again controls cytokine production, so it impacts this way that cells can communicate with each other. And it modulates the production of key inflammation signaling molecules. So it really changes how the immune system can communicate, and especially how the immune system can shut itself down. Deficiency is associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis and Graves' disease, pemphigus vulgaris, and lichen planus. Where do we get selenium? Our top source is shellfish, especially oysters, clams, mussels, but also fish in general, organ meat, red meat, chicken, nuts, especially Brazil nuts, leafy greens, eggs, cruciferous vegetables, and mushrooms. Zinc. 73% of us are deficient. And zinc is the second most abundant mineral in the human body after iron. It has a tremendous number of roles in the human body. It's important for the activity of approximately 300 different enzymes. So it is involved in regulating DNA and RNA transcription, in regulating cell survival, in the absorption and activity of B vitamins. So zinc deficiency can look like B vitamin deficiency, which then can affect methylation, which then can affect detoxification. It's important for muscle contraction, and important for connective tissue formation. It's involved in the production of insulin and testosterone, so being zinc deficient can eventually lead to hyperglycemia. And it's a component of the vitamin D receptor, so being zinc deficiency can change how vitamin D can signal. In the adaptive immune system, it controls cell differentiation and activation of T cells, so it controls how these cells mature and turn on and do their job. And it reduces the cytokine production by some of our biggest culprits in autoimmune disease, Th1 and Th17 cells. So if you're zinc deficient, then those cells are sending out more inflammatory signals. Zinc deficiency is associated with rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, pemphigus vulgaris, Alzheimer's disease, autoimmune hepatitis, primary biliary cirrhosis, autoimmune thyroid diseases, lupus, celiac disease, and type 1 diabetes. Our top food sources of zinc are oysters. They're just tremendous, but all shellfish really are great sources of zinc. Liver, wild game, red meat, other types of organ meat, mushrooms, and seaweed. Iodine also has really important roles in the human body, and even though with iodized salt, most of us are not deficient, when you're adopting an autoimmune protocol, thinking about sources of dietary iodine are still really important. So iodine is involved in the development and proper function of the thyroid. It's an essential component of thyroid hormones. It's an important antioxidant, and it also has some roles in normalizing cortisol secretion in response to stress. In the immune system, a lot of the phagocytic cells, so these eater cells like macrophages and neutrophils, produce iodoproteins, and it seems to be an important part of how they do their job. And deficiency, of course, is associated with autoimmune thyroid conditions. So if we're not going to consume iodized salt, because we're not, we're going to be swapping that out for sea salt. Sea salt is not iodized, although it does contain some natural iodine. Other great sources of iodine are seaweed, fish, shellfish, grass-fed dairy, eggs, poultry, legumes, prunes, and bananas. Now, magnesium, 68% of us are deficient. And magnesium, again, has tremendous roles in the human body. It's used by 300 different enzymes. It's essential for ATP synthesis. That's that energy molecule that's used by all cells in the body. It's important for DNA and RNA synthesis. It's a constituent of bones and teeth. It's used in neuromuscular contractions. It's involved in the production of sex hormones, specifically testosterone and progesterone. It's important for metabolism of a variety of other nutrients. So if you're magnesium deficient, then you're not metabolizing phosphorus, calcium, potassium, sodium, B vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin E. And it's a cofactor in methylation, which is, again, affecting detoxification systems. In the adaptive immune system, magnesium is essential for thymus health, and it's also really important for anti-inflammatory signals. Magnesium deficiency has been associated with lupus. So where are we getting magnesium? Our best source is seaweed, but also almost anything green. So dark leafy greens, chives, pumpkin seeds, fish, soy, Brazil nuts, sunflower seeds, lots of other nuts and seeds, and avocados. Vitamin C, we think of vitamin C as being a nutrient that's so easy to get, and yet 38% of us are still deficient. It has a primary role as an antioxidant, and in the immune system, in addition to being used as an antioxidant, so that protects against damage by oxidants, and oxidants are produced as one of the weapons against pathogens by the immune system. So in that role, it can also protect against things like gastritis, so it can help control things like H. pylori infections. Deficiency in vitamin C has been associated with lichen planus and idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura. The top food sources of vitamin C are citrus fruit, but cruciferous vegetables are right up there. Those are vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, and kale. Leafy greens, peppers, kiwi, berries, tropical fruit in general, melons, fresh herbs. Parsley is ridiculously high in vitamin C, and sweet potatoes. Omega-3 fats, DHA and EPA. When we look at the role that these fats have in our body, deficiency is not really measured because it's not really about how much absolute omega-3s you get, but the relationship of omega-3s to omega-6 fatty acids. And we're going to talk about this a lot more next week. But we know that these omega-3s are really, really important for a lot of inflammation signaling. So they're generally anti-inflammatory. They're also important for vascular health, neural health, vision health, fetal development. They're important for supporting a healthy microbial community in the gut. So we know that those cells really like living in an omega-3 rich environment. In the innate immune system, their role is primarily through signaling molecules, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in an upcoming lecture. In the adaptive immune system, having omega-3s embedded in the cell membrane of inflammatory cells improves the membrane dynamics, so improves the liquidity of those cell membranes. So when you think about a phagocyte, an eater cell that's going to wrap its membrane around a pathogen to engulf it, being able to have these really fluid and flexible membranes helps it to do its job. So when a cell membrane has more omega-6 fats in it, it's more rigid. And when it has more omega-3 fats in it, it's more fluid and flexible. So that's one of the reasons why the ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s that we eat is so important for immune health. Omega-3s also have a role in controlling cytokine production and just general gene expression that influences inflammation. And having sufficient omega-3s around inhibits the development of some effector T cells that can be overactive in autoimmune disease, specifically Th1, Th2, and Th17. Now again, it's sort of hard to measure deficiency, but we know that supplementation, typically through fish oil, has been beneficial in rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel diseases, psoriasis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, and also migraine headaches. Where are we getting DHA and EPA? I mean, our best sources are fish and shellfish, but we're getting this also from grass-fed meat, pasture-raised meat, the organ meat from grass-fed animals, grass-fed dairy, and seaweed. Now, there's a lot of foods that are recommended because they're high in omega-3s, things like flaxseed, chia seed. Those have ALA, which is a shorter chain omega-3 fatty acid, it has to be converted into DHA and EPA in order to be beneficial for the immune system in our bodies. There are some natural rules for ALA, but dominantly we use these longer chains, DHA and EPA. That conversion process is very inefficient, so it is always superior to get omega-3s from animal sources. So a lot of us don't think about fiber as being an essential nutrient. And in fact, it's not even classified as an essential nutrient, although I dispute that classification, because fiber is what makes a healthy gut microbiome. And approximately 90% of us don't get the daily allowance of fiber. So the USDA recommends 25 grams a day for women, 30 to 38 grams a day for men. Hunter-gatherers consume more like 50 to 200 grams a day of fiber. So we're not even meeting USDA recommendations, let alone what hunter-gatherers consume. So most of us are getting like 8 grams or less of fiber a day. It's pretty pitiful. And this is really important because fiber is the dominant food source for the bacteria in our digestive tract. Fiber is important for eliminating toxins, so there's a lot of ways that our bodies detoxify by putting toxins into our digestive tract. So for example, excess hormones, the byproducts of liver detoxification will get secreted into our digestive tract, where it's expected, if you're eating a vegetable-rich diet, that those toxic byproducts will bind with fiber and be eliminated in your stool. When it doesn't bind with fiber, it can be reabsorbed into the body, and then it has to go through that whole cycle all over again. So fiber is important for regulating hormones. It also regulates gut motility, so it has a really profound relationship to digestion. Those short-chain fatty acids that are so important for the health of the cells that line the digestive tract, but that can also be used as fuel for all of the cells in our body that are produced by our gut bacteria. They're produced by the gut bacteria fermenting fiber, right? It's eating fiber, and this is a byproduct of that chemical reaction. Fiber is also known to promote better sleep. So a high fiber diet can be very, very helpful in promoting sleep, which is then an important immune regulator. Now there's two main types of fiber: soluble fiber, which dissolves in water, and insoluble fiber, which doesn't. Generally, soluble fiber slows down digestion, whereas insoluble fiber speeds it up and adds bulk to stool. Both are really important, and both types of fiber generally are fermentable. So that means both types of fiber most of the time can be used as food for the gut bacteria. And in fact, we're gonna see in a little bit more detail later on that insoluble fiber, when it comes, we need both, but insoluble fiber is like the better anti-inflammatory signal, the better food for the most desirable strains of bacteria. Now, I'll remind you that our gut bacteria are a really critical component of health, that they not just aid digestion and synthesize vitamins and regulate neurotransmitters and regulate the immune system, but that their effects on the immune system are exactly what we're looking for when we're looking to regulate the immune system to mitigate autoimmune disease. And what are the best sources of fiber? Vegetables and fruit. In fact, there's a really interesting collection of studies showing that the fiber from grains don't have the same benefits than the fiber from vegetables and fruit. And so a lot of the metrics that we use to evaluate how beneficial a high fiber diet is don't apply from grain fiber. We really want vegetable and fruit fiber. Vegetables and fruit are also really high in phytochemicals. In fact, there's not a whole lot of phytochemicals in grains. Phytochemicals are some of our best sources of antioxidants, but a lot of them have other great beneficial qualities, like they're anti-inflammatory, they're anti-cancer, they're cardioprotective. And what's really interesting is there's 6,000 or more different phytochemicals. We really only understand the exact rules of a few dozen of them. So it's really hard to evaluate them as essential or non-essential, or to evaluate the role of deficiency, because we just don't understand them that well. But we see in scientific studies over and over and over again that high phytochemical diets are beneficial, that they reduce risk of chronic disease, that they lower inflammation, that they can even extend lifespan. And we know that supplementation with phytochemicals can be beneficial in autoimmune thyroid conditions and type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis. And so really any fruit or vegetable is going to be rich in phytochemicals. They're going to provide a diversity of phytochemicals. Some of The superfoods out there are leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, anything with a strong pigment, so anything with a really bright color, so for example, berries, but also fresh herbs are another great source, and even some spices, great sources of phytochemicals. So one of the things that I did as I went through these lists is I didn't censor them. So you saw things like soy and legumes and dairy show up on those lists a little bit. I didn't want to cut those out if they were a good source of those specific nutrients. But one of the other things that you probably noticed with those lists of top food sources of these various really important immune health nutrients is there were certain foods that kept cropping up over and over and over again. It wasn't soy, it wasn't legumes, it wasn't dairy that kept cropping up over and over again. It was organ meats, especially liver. It was seafood, fish, shellfish, and sea vegetables, and it was all different kinds of vegetables. Over and over and over again, you were seeing those crop up on these lists. You also saw mushrooms and fruit, and eggs and nuts and seed and grass-fed dairy. We're going to talk about why eggs, nuts and seeds, and grass-fed dairy have some cons to consider as well. So they're not just all pros. There's some pros and cons with those foods, which is why they're eliminated on the autoimmune protocol. But you'll see that these foods that form the basis of the autoimmune protocol, they're all the foods that offer the most nutrients and the most immune health nutrients that our bodies need. So we see these as really thematic foods that are really essential for overall health.